For over 70 years, the Korean Peninsula has officially been in a state of war. It's a really strange thought, right? The actual fighting stopped decades ago, but the conflict itself was never resolved. It's created one of the most tense, long-running standoffs in modern history. So today, we're going to dig it in and figure out exactly how that happened. So let's just get right to the heart of it with the biggest question of all. Why? Why, after all this time, are North and South Korea still technically at war? Well, to get the answer, we have to rewind the clock way back. I mean, just look at this contrast. It's incredible. For 1,300 years, Korea was one single unified nation. One people, one culture. Now, it's two nations, split by one of the most heavily armed borders on the planet, and they're locked in a conflict that never officially ended. This isn't some ancient rivalry. It's a very fresh, very deep wound. Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we'll look at how this one nation got divided in the first place. Then, we'll cover the start of the war and how it ground down into a horrible stalemate. And finally, we'll get into the so-called long ceasefire and why this conflict is still unresolved today. The story of Korea's division actually begins with the end of another massive war, World War II. When Korea was liberated from Japanese rule in 1945, it should have been a moment of pure celebration. Instead, it planted the seeds for a brand new conflict. So here's what happened. It's 1945. The war is ending. The Soviet Union enters Korea from the north, and the US comes in from the south. In a pretty hasty decision, they decide to split the peninsula right down the middle, at the 38th parallel line of latitude. They said it was just temporary. But as the Cold War heated up, temporary started to look a lot like permanent. By 1948, you had two totally separate states, the communist DPRK in the north, backed by the Soviets, and the capitalist ROK in the south, backed by the US. A year later, the foreign troops pull out, and suddenly you have these two rival Koreas staring each other down across a line on a map. And that's the real tragedy here. This was never a Korean idea. It was a line drawn by outsiders that quickly turned into a major frontline of the Cold War. It literally ripped a country in two. So with both sides believing they were the rightful rulers of the entire peninsula, and with tensions just skyrocketing, it was really only a matter of time before that cold standoff turned hot. What began as a civil war was about to go global fast. And then it happened. In the early morning hours of June 25, 1950, North Korea launched a massive, surprise invasion across the 38th parallel. The South Korean military was completely caught off guard, totally unprepared. The world was stunned. The North's advance was unbelievably fast. They took the capital, Seoul, in just a few days, and nearly pushed the South Koreans right off the peninsula. In response, the brand new United Nations, led by the US, authorized military intervention. UN forces, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, pulled off a brilliant counterattack, pushing the North Koreans all the way back, past the 38th parallel and deep into North Korea. It looked like the war might be over. But as UN troops got close to the Chinese border, China jumped into the war, sending hundreds of thousands of troops pouring across, and it completely changed the game. After that first year of wild, dramatic swings back and forth, the war entered a new and truly awful phase. The days of rapid advances were over. What came next was a grinding, bloody war where nobody went anywhere. Yeah, that massive wave of Chinese troops pushed the UN forces all the way back south again, and the front line eventually settled pretty much right back where the whole thing started, around the 38th parallel. And for the next 2 years, the fighting became this horrible trench-style warfare. Think World War I. Just brutal battles over small hills with names like Pork Chop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge, with thousands dying for a few yards of land. And the human toll of this stalemate is just hard to even comprehend. It's estimated that as many as 3 million civilians died during the war. That was about 10% of the entire Korean population at the time. North Korea, in particular, was subjected to a relentless bombing campaign, making it one of the most heavily bombed countries in history. By the end of 1952, everybody could see how pointless this was becoming. President-elect Eisenhower went to Korea and summed it all up perfectly. He said, you just can't keep accepting these kinds of casualties for nothing. It was clear that a military victory was impossible. They had to find another way out. And this right here, this is the absolute core of why the war never truly ended. The fighting stopped, sure, but it stopped with a very specific kind of deal, one that left the entire conflict totally unresolved. Okay, so this distinction is everything. An armistice is basically just a timeout. It's everyone agreeing to put their guns down, a ceasefire. A peace treaty, on the other hand, is the end of the game. It formally declares the war is over and settles the issues. The Korean War got the armistice, but it never ever got the peace treaty. So, after these long, drawn-out negotiations, the armistice was finally signed on July 27, 1953. It stopped the fighting, it set up a prisoner exchange, and it created that 4-kilometer-wide buffer between the two countries that we now know as the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. But get this, the agreement was shaky from the absolute beginning. South Korea's own president at the time, Syngman Rhee, hated the idea of a divided Korea so much that he flat out refused to sign the armistice. He only reluctantly agreed to go along with it. That tells you just how fragile this end to the fighting really was. And that brings us to today. That fragile armistice wasn't an ending. It was really just the beginning of a whole new chapter of conflict, one that's lasted for over 70 years. And here's the result. Without that peace treaty, the war is basically just flash frozen in time. It's what experts call a frozen conflict. The active fighting is over, but legally, politically, the state of war still exists. And that limbo is the source of all the tension we still see today. And the legacies of this, they're just immense. You have the DMZ, which remains one of the most fortified borders on Earth. You have millions of Korean families that were torn apart by the war, many of whom never saw their relatives again. And the decades since have been punctuated by violent clashes, raids, and naval battles. This unfinished war continues to be a huge flashpoint in global politics. So we end up right back where we started. For more than 70 years, this armistice, this pause, has somehow managed to hold. It's prevented another full-scale war, but it has never delivered a real lasting peace. And even with moments of hope and dialogue, that fundamental state of war is always there, lurking under the surface. And it leaves all of us with this one giant unresolved question. What does the future hold for the Korean Peninsula?